Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, looking at the stories by which we deeply live. Pop quiz. What do Schlegel, Novalis, Holderlin, Hesse, Schelling, and much later Thomas Berry have in common? Answer. They all call for a new mythology. And we could also add best-selling science fiction author P.J. Manning to the list. She calls for a new mythos. In the common Western use of the word mythology, it tends to be understood as outdated explanations for things that science now explains, like weather and earthquakes and all that. Those of us who study it at a deeper level see wisdoms encoded in the stories if we don't take them literally. And so when a mythology is active, when it serves as sacred stories about the divine, for instance, people alternate between taking those literally, and there's always a group of people in any culture who don't take the stories literally. They see them more symbolically. So mythology really isn't something that we ever get beyond. We can stand back from it a bit, but there's no cultural progression by which we're simply free of it. For example, the sinking of not only the original Titanic, but the submersible Titan, repeating the story out of ancient Greek myth of the defeat of the Titans in eerie detail. The drive to invent ways to upload human consciousness into a machine or even into the internet echoes old myths of the spirit ascending into heaven and going to a better place, leaving the body and the earth behind. According to Thomas Berry, we're waiting for a new story, a new comprehensive story to explain to us who we are, our place in the world, our place in the cosmos, because the old story, Christianity, has worn out for a number of us. So there are a couple of assumptions built into this that I would like to take issue with, and one of them is that there actually is no comprehensive story that's true for everyone. There were plenty of people on the planet when Thomas Berry wrote that who weren't Christians, for instance. Also, grand stories or grand narratives, as they've come to be known, have a totalizing effect, meaning they tend to get dropped on people from above, and they freeze huge areas of human experience, and they always exclude large groups of people. So I'm not sure that's a direction we can recommend. Single stories that pretend to comprehensiveness tend to be dangerous. But in a world where there is an incredible dynamic of diverse cultures, diverse voices being joined ever more rapidly together on a planetary scale, it does seem worth thinking about the possibility that there might be a cycle of stories, a sort of planetary mythology, but it would have to look different from the mythologies of old, given where we are historically right now. And instead of being opposed from the top down by powerful elites, it would have to be grown from the ground up through innumerable ongoing conversations across divisions of sex and race and gender and culture and nation, economic class, you name it. So I recently sat down and made my own list, by no means comprehensive, in response to the question, what might a cycle of stories, a sort of planetary mythology, what might it need in order to function? What might be the necessary elements for something like that? So I'm going to share my list. It's a work in progress, and I invite you to create your own. Because one of the habits of mind we need to get away from is putting ourselves in the position of, okay, I'm going to decide what the new mythology is and what it isn't. That the authority move, right? Which we've been subjected to for probably 10,000 years at least. And I refer to that sometimes as monocreedism. Not quite the same thing as monotheism, If we look at the universe as an interplay of the one and the many, as philosophy in the West has, other philosophies too, come to think of it, then monocretism says only the one matters, the one God, the one cause. Everything reduces down to it, instead of it being an interplay between the two, between unity and diversity. If we favor the one, we get totalitarianism of different kinds. If we favor only the many, we get fragmentation. So we need to replace reducing all of experience from one to the other with allowing them to speak to each other. So here's my off the top of my head list. What does the new story cycle and updated lore need to include? So I put together 10 points here just to get the conversation started. And number one on my list, which I just sort of spoke to, is inclusivity and delight in difference. Stories, in other words, about the human family and its place in the world. I hold diversity, whatever we want to call it. The founders of the United States government called it plurality, among other terms. But whatever word we want to use, it's built into the fabric of the cosmos, as Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, liked to point out. So diversity is cosmic. Philosophers might use a different term and say diversity is ontological. It's built into existence itself. So inclusivity and delight in difference, that has to be part of whatever planetary set of stories we're interested in telling, writing, and performing. That's number one on my list. Number two is rejoining the great conversation on Earth. And by great conversation, I'm using a term that Jake Sherman and a number of other philosophers and eco people have used to point out that we aren't the only beings that are speaking and interacting on this planet. There's our more than human or non-human, whatever term, other creatures, right? So you go for a walk in the woods or on the shoreline and you immediately hear insects and birds and other things speaking. We've forgotten that we are a part of that conversation. And my work in parapsychology and ecopsychology has emphasized this, as have other people in those fields. So rejoining the great conversation, stories about that. 3, post-belief receptivity to sacred experience. Visionary experience is real. It is something that we should validate. It doesn't mean that the person who has it becomes, the next supposed savior of the world. It's actually fairly common. So stories that don't try to elevate that to something to believe in. I think belief is hugely overrated. But just receptivity to it, letting those experiences of the sacred be. 4th on my list is inspiring fictions, and this is where hope punk and the work of a lot of science fiction authors comes in. P.J. Manny has spoken about this in lectures, Kim Stanley Robinson, lots of other people. And it's the need for the kinds of fictions that inspire us to change how we are with each other in beneficial ways, to actually dwell on this planet than existing on it, for instance. Fictions that help us create social justice and equity and things like that. So that inspire us above all. Number 5, restoryings and reinterpretations of traditional lore. Here is a very modest example. Maybe I'll provide a couple of them. So in the Gospels, to take Christianity as an example, there are places where Jesus admonishes people for trying to correct each other in ways that lack self-awareness, as we would now call it. So for instance, he says, you can't reach over and take a splinter out of your brother's eye if your sight is occluded by the beam that's sticking out of your eye. So a contemporary way of interpreting this would be projection, as psychotherapists call it. You're so worried about correcting other people and making sure that their behavior matches your standards and that, for some reason they're accountable to you instead of to themselves, And you're walking around with this huge shadow that you're putting on other people. You need to own your own stuff. You know, you need to take back your projections and ask yourself, what do I need to fix about myself? So that's a very small example of reinterpreting lore, reinterpreting ancient teachings to fit our time. Because we can't just leave them behind. We can't just ignore them. Because as Freud and a number of other people have pointed out, if you leave the stage prematurely, you recreate it somewhere else. We can't just walk away from old stories. We have to understand why they gripped us and what we can learn from them and what they've done from us. And at that point, dissolve them and use their elements to make new stories. So in item 5 of my list, that has to do with restoring, reinterpreting traditional lore. Here's another example. It's funny how much this one's neglected. There's a lot of talk within, I'll use Christianity again. This could be done for any ancient traditions, any ancient religions, what have you. There was a lot of talk in my church growing up about grace, being open to the transformative aspect of grace. And so in the Gospel of John, and this is the part that gets ignored, Jesus mentioned that he needs to move on so that what he calls the Comforter, it's been translated different ways, can appear. And so a contemporary way of understanding that might be not to idealize our teachers. He's been hanging up on that cross for more than 2,000 years. Maybe we should let him down and get on about his business. So, seriously, the message might be that there's this wonderful presence and aliveness in the universe and things and each other. Who knows where it comes from? Religious people say that it's of God. That's fine. Why don't we just be open to it and make that something that we focus on instead of on a person, or instead of making a person God, or what have you, right? So those are two modest examples of reinterpreting the lore, and there can be many interpretations. The thing about these rich pieces of lore is that they're open to so many different ways of holding them. So number 6, friendliness to science, if not scientism. There's a difference. So scientism is an ideology. The notion that only science can tell us true things is a fundamentalism. It's a fundamentalist psychology. It's religious, but it's unconsciously religious. So that's not what I mean by friendliness to science. I mean openness to scientific discovery and the things that science can tell us, which is something that Thomas Berry and Brian Swim also emphasize. Number 7 on my list is an ethic of care over abstract principle or ideology. Centuries of logic chopping about whether one person should save 3 or in court, whether you broke this law or that law or whatever, and the heart gets lost. Where is the care? What has happened to the idea that the heart of law should be mercy? What is it with this need to punish? So care says, you have had terrible things happen to you, and while we may not excuse your behavior and will hold you accountable for it, we also need to recognize what the circumstances are. An ethic of care means that to have poor people walking around the richest country in the world, or the richest countries in the world, is an abomination. It's deeply unjust. We need to look out for each other. That's why we're here. One of the reasons we're here. So that is number 7, an ethic of care. 8, faith in humanity versus so-called morality, in other words, rule following, blind rule following that comes from some authority, whether it's God or the Bible or the government or what have you. One that confuses conscience with following rules. If you need the threat of punishment to stop yourself from killing somebody just because you feel like it, or from just behaving outrageously or what have you, you're in deep trouble psychologically. There's a lot more to that than a rule book. So unless something happens to us that traumatizes us deeply, and on top of that we make wrong, bad decisions, we can be counted on usually to do the right thing by ourselves and each other. Faith in humanity. Number 9, stories of wise leadership. What does it look like to be a wise leader? What does it mean to be a wise leader? What does it involve? Number 10, a cause for faith and hope. Something to get on board with, something to work toward. In my case, I've given that the science fiction sounding word Terrania, which I've talked about in other podcasts. And Terrania for me is a society planetary in scope, but grown from the ground up. A society for embodied, fully responsible human beings. Humanity comes of age. Does that mean utopia? I don't think we're capable of utopia, given what I know about human nature. There will always be some kind of trouble or conflict, wherever there are humans. But I think we can make the good society. I think we can outgrow and overcome the obstacles that we now face and end up in a better place. A good start might be recovering our ability to imagine hopeful outcomes, to imagine where we want to go, and to do that together at some point, relearning how to dream together, which is still being done in some small communities. My term for this is one that I borrow from my own science fiction. So, dreaming together, hoping, and then being willing to move toward that. My term for this is lamp lighting. Lighting the lamps on the road to a better future, a better culture, a better society. The one that I have faith that we are capable of creating. So if you're interested in how that plays out in fiction, you can go to my webpage, chalkwist.com/fiction. And there's a couple of things you'll find there. One is a free collection of stories called Tales of Terrania Rising. And it charts our way forward from the distant past, the ancestral past, all the way up to Terrania in the future to show the long human struggle toward consciousness, responsibility, appreciation of diversity, rejoining the great conversation. And we don't keep trying to force the gods or God or spirit or what have you to be our ideal parents that we never had, and thereby stay psychologically childish. We have put away childish things, as Paul mentions, and moved toward fully responsible adulthood and taken upon ourselves the task of creating a good society where everybody has more than enough and warfare is seen as archaic and unacceptable, and where we look out for each other. Some philosophers would see this as a result of the evolution of consciousness, and that's one way of thinking about it. But I put more emphasis on the developmental dimension of all this because to me what it means is that as a species we've grown up, we've come of age. The injustices that we suffer most from today are all things perpetrated by the psychologically immature among us, particularly those who wield enormous power and influence. When you have people in high places with the psychology, the emotional psychology of 5-year-olds at best, the news is how things look. And sitting around hoping that somebody better will come along as leaders and help us out of all this is also a move of psychological immaturity. It's the child position of we just need the parents to come along and take care of things. No, we don't. We need to take care of things ourselves. And one place to start, one modest place, is in the stories, the cycles of stories that we begin telling that recognize how things are today. We don't want to be in denial, but that use that as a point of departure into imaginings and then hopefully later actions toward that which we most desire as a way to live on this incredibly complex and miraculous planet floating in what seems to be an infinite cosmos. Thank you.